Well, greetings, aerospace and cyber 2020 attendees. I'm Dave DEPTULA, Dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, and welcome to our special virtual ASC Aerospace Nation panel, Is the Air Force Getting Its Fair Share? Transparency in Budgets. By way of introducing this topic, a little bit of background. The size of the Air Force and its corresponding modernization accounts were dramatically cut in the years immediately following the Cold War, and again following the 2007 troop surge to Iraq. Now, after decades of hard use and too little investment, the Air Force now has more mission demand than resources to fulfill that demand. For the Air Force, the defense modernization holiday of the 90s has lasted for decades, and it's the reason the Air Force faces a significant strategy resource gap. The Air Force's share of the defense budget has slowly increased since the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2015, with about 3.7% of real growth per year to the Air Force's top-line budget. This modest increase has helped the Air Force address some of its most critical readiness problems, but it has not placed it on a stable trajectory toward fielding a modernized future force that will meet the priorities of the national defense strategy. Building the Air Force our nation needs requires the administration and Congress to work together to increase the service's annual budget. Absent a commitment, the Air Force we need will remain out of reach. Addressing this head-on, a myth persists that the Air Force is funded equally with the other services at about 1/3 of the budget. However, the Department of Defense only allocates 20% or 1/5 of the budget to actual Air Force capabilities. This excludes pass-through funding for programs that the service does not control, mostly national intelligence-related programs, and we'll hear a little bit more about that shortly. Complicating this picture is the creation of the United States Space Force, which is responsible for yet another budget that falls under the Air Force's budget authority, but none of it goes to modernization of Air Force air power. If we honestly and accurately look at budget trends, the nation has dramatically underfunded the Air Force, especially compared to the other services. Congress has at least called for force structure assessments in its 2018 National Defense Authorization Act. That assessment concluded that the Air Force must grow its capacity to 386 operational squadrons from the 312 that we have today, just to meet the current national security requirements. So the Air Force is operating at about a 24% deficit to the needs of the national defense strategy, and this situation cannot be corrected without increased resources being allocated to the Air Force. Now, I'd like to extend a very special and a warm welcome to U.S. Congressman Don Bacon, former Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Buzz Moseley, and Mr. Richard MCCONN, who's the chairman of the NDIA, to discuss this serious situation. Just a little bit of background on each, for those of you who may be really, really young. General Mike Buzz Moseley is a command pilot with more than 3,000 hours and trainers in the F-15. He served as our 18th Chief of Staff of the Air Force, foresaw the great power competition that we're experiencing today, and is an untiring advocate for Air Force modernization and recapitalization to meet that challenge. Congressman Don Bacon represents Nebraska's 2nd District and serves on the House Armed Services Committee. Prior to his election to Congress, Don served 30 years in the Air Force, retiring with the rank of Brigadier General in 2014. Mr. Dick McConn is chairman of the board of the National Defense Industrial Association. The NDIA works to drive strategic dialogue and national security by identifying key issues and leveraging the knowledge and experience of its military, government, industry, and academic members. So thank you all for being here today for this very important discussion. What I'd like to do is first extend the opportunity for General Moseley to address Air Force modernization challenges and offer a remedy for our aging inventory and recapitalization needs. Representative Bacon will then present his perspectives on the subject, shedding light on the 20% of the Air Force budget that goes to the intelligence community. And then to wrap it up, Mr. MCCONN will then provide his insights and observations from his position as the chairman of the NDIA. So thank you, gentlemen, for your insights on this topic. And over to you, Chief Moseley.
Well, General DEPTULA, thank you. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you again, and also with Congressman Bacon and Mr. MCCONN. So thank you for the opportunity to talk a little bit about our beloved Air Force and perhaps some prescriptions that we can discuss, and perhaps, if not change some minds, at least illuminate some of the challenges. You asked me for some brief comments on modernization, recapitalization. Let me start. I think there's 3 or 4 things that are key elements to this, that anybody in Washington or outside of Washington, in the Congress or in the media or in the building, I think has to realize up front when you discuss this issue is, first off, what does an Air Force do? What is expected of an Air Force? I think it's easy to assume that people understand that a Navy's mission is to dominate blue water, and that an Army's mission is to dominate land combat. Now, you can look at that as strategic commons or operating domains. The United States Air Force is responsible now with Space Force for dominating air breathing, the atmosphere, and also exo-atmospheric or out into space. I would also offer that while that seems intuitive, there are a lot of people that assume that this mission is easy, and perhaps that's because airmen make it look so easy, people think it actually is easy, when just the opposite of that is actually true. This is a very difficult and a very complex set of operations. So to understand what an Air Force does, I think it's also illustrative to think about what does an Air Force do independently, and what does an Air Force do in concert with joint brothers and sisters. The second one's pretty easy. The Air Force establishes air dominance, so any surface activity is free to maneuver, free to mass, free to operate without fear of attack from the air. So for a member of a joint team, that's what an Air Force does for our surface brothers and sisters, is we provide an environment for them to freely maneuver, free from attack from the air. An independent look at this, though, if you look at the campaigns of Iraq I, Iraq II, Afghanistan, and you can in fact go back to 1916, 1917, when people were struggling, what does an independent Air Force mean? There was a guy named Mitchell who was pretty clear about what an independent Air Force was about. There was a guy named Boone Trenchard in the UK. But I think it goes to the notion of access. The Air Force is the only service, space now included, that is free from natural barriers of coastlines, of water, of mountains, of rivers. So an Air Force does have an independent operating domain because it is not encumbered by physical barriers. So an Air Force can strike into the heart of an opponent on a global scale. It can maintain vigilance. It can move things around on a global scale, or it can strike targets on a global scale because it's not limited by coastlines or mountains or rivers or anything like that. So what does an Air Force do? An Air Force is a long-range global capability for the President of the National Command Authority to be able to use to deter, to dissuade, to persuade, or failing that, to fight. It's also a member of the Joint Team. So what complicates that today? It's fascinating to read in some of the media that the American military has been at war for 15 or 16 years. In fact, the American Air Force has been deployed and in combat for 31 years. August of 1990, first fighter wing deployed into the Eastern Province, Saudi Arabia, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and we've never left. From Desert Shield, Desert Storm, through no-fly zones, through 9/11 to Afghanistan, to enduring freedom, to Iraqi freedom, to Mogadishu, Somalia, Yemen, while doing Korea, while doing deterrence and deterrence missions on a global scale. So 31 years of deployments, continual deployments and combat operations. Imagine if this were a taxi cab company, or if those of us in this room had pooled some of our family resources to open a set of Uber opportunities, and we were operating basically the same equipment for 31 years. Well, that's the condition that the Air Force finds itself in right now. In fact, General DEPTULA and I have sons and son-in-laws that actually are flying, have flown the exact airplanes that we flew when General DEPTULA was a lieutenant and I was a junior captain. The same tail numbers. We have tankers that were built at the end of the Eisenhower administration, the beginning of the Kennedy administration, in combat. We have bombers that were built in the Kennedy administration. So let me rephrase what I'm saying here. What does an Air Force do for the country? It provides the ability for a president or a national command authority to persuade, to dissuade, to deter, or to fight on a global scale. And the United States Air Force has been in combat for 31 years. Now, what's the impact of that? A lot of the same airplanes have been deployed. Think of the wear and tear on the airframe, the engines, the avionics. And at the same time, we've gone through multiple administrations where we did not recapitalize. In the early years after the Reagan administration, in President Bush's first term, we used to talk about we need to buy at least 65 to 75 airplanes a year to maintain the average age. Not to break the average age and get younger, but just to maintain. And if you look at numbers, there were years through the Clinton administration, the second Bush administration, and into the Obama administration, we didn't even come close to that. And as the airplanes got older, the number actually went up. So we are not recapitalizing or modernizing at a rate equal to the aging of the systems that we have. And the older the airplane is, the more it costs to fly and to maintain, and the less capable it is. So the budgets, if I were to offer a remedy, and I think we'll get to this in a minute, General DEPTULA, is the percent of the budget that goes to DOD over the last few decades has been roughly 3 to 4%. In my time as the chief, my testimony to our friends on the Hill is we need an absolute floor of at least 4%. If I were to testify today, I would say that it has to be 5%. And that's a floor. Any contingencies comes above that because that inventory has to be recapitalized, whether it's a fleet of taxi cabs, Uber, school buses, or flying machines. So I think the first step, and then I'll stand down off the podium here, is to address the amount of money that is authorized and appropriated for DOD, which I believe the floor now should be about 5%. And if you think back into the 70s, we were up to 8%, 9%. And before that, we were up to 20%, 25%. Now, I'm not advocating that at all. I'm just saying the country survived that. So if you want to deal with near-peer competitors that we're facing now, plus a Space Force, plus a Navy that is woefully too small, and an Army that needs to modernize and recapitalize as well, and an Air Force that's the oldest and smallest in its history, then you're going to have to budget for it. You're going to have to pay for it. The Tooth Fairy is not going to come with a magic wand and make all that happen. You're going to have to physically lay out the dollars to recapitalize and modernize. So, General DEPTULA, with that, I'll stand by.
Very good. Thanks very much, Chief. Over to you, Congressman Bacon.
Well, first of all, I just want to say thanks to General Moseley, our great chief, for his words, and he's absolutely right. We are spending at near an all-time low when it comes to our share of our GDP towards defense. It's not the lowest, but it's near that all-time low, and a lot of folks do not realize that. I just want to take a moment to thank General DEPTULA. He's been a great friend when I started on the Air Staff and now in my current role. And I want to thank Mr. MCCONN for his advocacy for our military and the Air Force. And I go back to General Moseley, though. You know, his concerns when he was the chief, worrying about near-peer competitors, he was extraordinarily prescient. And I think as we look back, he was telling the truth. And today we are looking at the reality that he was laying out a decade and a half ago. So I thank him for that. What I want to focus on today is the pass-through budget, because this gets to part of the reasons why the Air Force is being underfunded. When I talk to my peers in Congress, most of them would say, Don, we're dividing up the budget by thirds. And so a third's going to the Air Force, third Navy, third Army. So there's an even proportion there, goes to DOD, and that's the way it should be. And I think that's wrong on two different levels. First of all, the current budget is obscured because of the pass-through budget. So for everyone, just to lay it all on the table, the Air Force budget's around $207 billion. There's a $43 billion pass-through budget for all of DoD that goes through the services. $38 billion is through the Air Force. So in other words, the Air Force is paying 88% of the pass-through budget that's going to various agencies out there that we won't talk about here. So you take that budget the Air Force has, you have to subtract $38 billion. Not a penny of that is actually going to the Air Force. But yet, most people in Congress don't realize that. It's really, very few people have that notion. And they would just say, yeah, a third of it's going to the Air Force. And I think if we're going to budget accurately and develop the right priorities, the decision makers, the folks who are voting on the budget, need to have a good realization that it's not a third. You got to take that 207 billion, subtract 38 billion. And I would just say very few people realize it. Now, I would also share, I don't necessarily think that it's got to be a third, a third, a third. You know, we want to have a strategy, and we want to fund towards a strategy. And I could make a great case that the Air Force can hit any target, anywhere, at any time, and can bring more lethality within short order than any other service. And so the funding shouldn't just be directed by a third, a third, a third. It should be based on a strategy, based on lethality, based on the needs that we have. But to make those decisions, you got to know what we're actually spending. And today, that fact is obscured to most because of this pass-through budget. So I submitted a bill, HR 6229, the Air Force Budget Transparency Act, and it would direct DoD to break out that funding and put it under, another way I would recommend, under OSD. And here's the concern. I hear from various folks, Don, we don't want to talk about what's in that $43 billion, but we don't have to. We can just take that $43 billion, group it together, move it to OSD. We don't have to talk about subparts and where all that money's going. But what it would do is it would allow the decision makers to know exactly what is going to the Air Force, what is exactly going to the Army, and what's exactly going to the Navy. And frankly, it puts us in ground truth so that we can make the right decisions. And I think that's what we need, is that transparency and just honesty, not only to the Congress, to the servicemen and women, but also to the citizens of our country. I think it's better to be very clear where our money is going. There's a second issue here, is that DoD spent a lot of time working on efficiencies in the fourth estate. Where can we make some smart cuts? And there's an $88 billion budget that goes to the fourth estate. Roughly 5% has been reduced through OSD oversight. And they're putting that money where it needs to go. The issue here is, though, that the pass-through spending had not been looked at. I think we should put that pass-through funding right there in OSD so it gets the same oversight and the same scrutiny as everything else does in our DoD. So on two different levels, we need to have this pass-through money separated so we have clarity and transparency in where the money's going with our services, but also the money where the pass-through money's going, it needs to be looked at in OSD as well for oversight, for just to make sure we're spending our money the way it needs to be spent and be looked at like the fourth estate has already been done. So by doing this, we can better determine what are the priorities of the services, where do we need to adjust money, and I would echo General Moseley's case that the Air Force is woefully funded. I think by having this clarity, this transparency, the Air Force can make a better case that it needs to have a higher priority for some of the funding. So with that, I yield back using terms of Congress.
Well, thanks very much, Mr. Congressman. Very much appreciate your perspective and all that you're trying to do to induce some common sense and transparency, as you say, into the Department of Defense budgeting process. So with that, let's turn it over to Mr. Dick McConn, Chairman of NDIA. Dick?
Well, thank you, Dave, and to the Mitchell Institute and the Air Force Association for this opportunity to participate today. And I'm honored to be amongst the likes of General Moseley and Congressman Bacon to be able to talk today. The pass-through issue of $38.2 billion, that's this year's number, which is about 5.4% of the DoD budget. It's important, and it brings up many larger issues affecting our defense budget and our defense industry. And those issues include, and some have been referred to already, transparency, allocation of priorities, service rivalry for budget share, retirement of legacy systems, and how we get jointness in the future. Those are all important issues that we face, and discussing this issue brings them up. As the chairman of NDIA, the National Defense Industrial Association, we represent over 1,700 defense companies, universities, and national laboratories, all of whom are greatly affected by the defense budgets and their allocations. We face some daunting questions right now, such as a reduced defense budget. Number two, how to preserve our industrial base and supply chain. Thirdly, how to protect our sensitive data. Fourthly, how intellectual property rights are going to be handled in the future. And finally, an increase in international competition in our business and what we do. To further identify and address these issues, NDIA publishes a comprehensive document annually. It's called The Vital Signs, the Health and Readiness of the Defense Industry. This is it, an excellent document, but it really identifies some of the problems that we face now and in the future. But back to the pass-through and fair share of our defense budget for the Air Force and actually for other services. Industry needs to know what the DoD priorities are and what the budget will be so it can best position itself to support the national security requirements. And probably 80% of new developments in technology nowadays are emanating from the commercial sector, and especially from small businesses. For FY21, we see the budget allocation split in roughly this manner. Army about 25.2%, Air Force 23.5%, Navy 22.8%, Marine Corps 6.5%, OSD was 16%, and pass-through at about 5.4%. And this adds up roughly to the $705 billion that we're talking about for FY21. And as we allocate money, according to DoD priorities, and we actually address the priorities, we've compiled kind of a rough list of the top 10 or so DoD priorities. And this is subjective in our list, but it has to do with dollar amounts spent and being spent. It has to do with what we think is relative importance to the defense of this country. And number one on the list would be the F-35, where we're spending about $407 billion just in acquisition costs. Then we list the Columbia-class submarine for the Navy as the second one. GBSD and the Minuteman reset, very important for us, an Air Force program. The B-21 bomber, which is about a $100 billion program, another Air Force program. Space, which we're allocating only $15.3 billion this year, but as you mentioned, Dave, that's going to increase very quickly. Again, we would look at the Air Force for the lead of this as the Space Force comes under the Air Force Secretary. The Joint All-Domain Command and Control, JADC2, which we're in, and the Air Force has just been appointed the lead in that. Hypersonics, where we're starting to spend billions, and all three services are involved in that right now with no lead. Long-range fires, which is led by the Army and the Marine Corps. And then finally, Ford-class submarines, which are actually up to $14 billion, aircraft carriers, which are actually up to about $14 billion an aircraft carrier these days, and that's a Navy lead. So intersecting all of these programs, and just as important to these programs, are a couple of other areas that must be financed and paid attention to. Cybersecurity and protecting our data. We are now well aware of China and the pilfering of millions and trillions of dollars in our data. And then finally, preserving our industrial database and supply chain. Now, these are important programs, and they call for the DoD to set priorities, make allocations, and assign leads on them. Assigning leads brings about accountability and affords duplication and avoids duplication of efforts. So We would like to see more accountability as far as the various services are concerned by assigning priorities and leads in the services. One can surmise from this list of top 10, however, that the 30-30-30-10 ratio is a metric of the past. If you take a look at the top 10 that I've listed, probably 6.5 of those are Air Force programs. And one could argue it might even be a little bit higher. But interesting to note how important the Air Force looks for the future. Back to the pass-through and transparency for just a minute. I observed in 2018 when we had this in the Senate Armed Services Committee bill and actually supported by appropriations. At that time, we felt very confident that we would eliminate the pass-through. However, Air Force weighed in at the last minute and asked that it be taken out. So we're the victims of some of our own positions in the past. I feel strongly this time we have a secretary, Barbara Barrett, that's quite supportive of eliminating the pass-through and for more transparency. And I'm hopeful at some point in the future, we'll be able to do it. We were unable to do it this year. We did have support from what we observed at NDIA. We did have support from the Senate Armed Services Committee. We had a problem in appropriations this year and just couldn't get any further. I leave that up to Congressman Bacon. I think he's working very hard on the House side, and hopefully we can rejuvenate and address this problem at some point in the near future. I want to talk about roadblocks for just a minute. There are quite a few that we face in trying to get this done. In other words, why can't we change this? People have to ask that. Why can't we get rid of the pass-through? Why can't we get a fair budget for the U.S. Air Force? Well, the first one obviously is Congress. Members are going to fight for what is built in their states and what's stationed in their states. We have select intelligence committees that do not want transparency and continue to want to keep this budget hidden, and they prefer for it to be hidden in the Air Force. We have the OMB in the White House. They have different ideas sometimes than what DOD has for budgets. And so we see that we get into difficulties between what they want and what we want on the DOD or the OSD side. Inter-service rivalry in competition for dollars. Every service is out there to justify his share of the budget. And it's a zero-sum game. Unfortunately, what General Moseley has said, I don't feel optimistic that no matter who is elected November 3rd, that we're going to see an increase in defense budgets. So in the zero-sum game, it's going to be, there's going to be some inter-service rivalry and competition, and understandably so. And then the U.S. Air Force itself. The U.S. Air Force needs to make its case to Congress and to OSD better. Frankly, other services have done it better in the past. We need more congressmen and senators like Congressman Bacon who understand the crucial role that air power plays now in places like Afghanistan, in Iraq, Syria, in NATO, the Pacific, and maintaining two legs of the triad, and one of the biggest deterrence factors that we have on the American side. Air Force influence needs a shot in the arm. And let me just pose a couple of rhetorical questions here. And when you look at Air Force influence, when did we have the last chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff? When did we have a commander of CENTCOM? And when did we have a commander of PACOM? I think most of us listening in or watching in understand that the answer to those questions are not very positive answers for the Air Force. So you can see how Air Force influence wanes. Finally, mainstream media and public opinion. I'm not sure that they understand in the outside world just how important the Air Force is. And I think between General Moseley and Congressman Bacon, I think they both feel the same way in what they've said earlier. Finally, to wrap up, I'd like to make some recommendations. Number one, the next Secretary of Defense should conduct a thorough review of budget allocations priorities and prioritizing dollars to the highest needs of DoD and our national defense strategy. With a most assuredly declining defense budget, I'll quote our new Chief of Staff, General C.Q. Brown. We must practice ruthless prioritization and end programs when we choose. And he recently said that, and I agree with that word, ruthless prioritization. Well,
So-
number 2, budgets must be set to the new warfighting realities and not service by surface ratios. Emerging technologies are here. Cyber, artificial intelligence, quantum, directed energy, multi-domain, etc. They demand a budget rethink. Number 3, the 30-30-30-10 ratio must be retired, and realistic budgeting matching top priorities must take over. Number 4, jointness must be emphasized, with parochialism taking a back seat. Let me commend our last chief, Dave Goldfein, for his unswerving and hard work to achieve jointness. Number 5, transparency of spending and metrics needs to improve. Pass-through hidden under Air Force should be moved to OSD budget. And I think Congressman Bacon has already well made that point, and we couldn't agree more. Number 6, legacy aircraft and other archaic systems must be allowed to retire. A-10s, B-1Bs, KC-135s, U-2s, if you will. Number 7, DOD and OSD should define and appoint which branch, which service will lead on important projects. Hopefully avoiding duplication of effort, improving spending efficiencies, and with clear lines of authority. One good example is Secretary Esper's recent decision on JADC2, where he decided in favor of the Air Force to lead. Air Force and other services must continue to work closely with our great American industrial base to develop and perfect the latest technology. We must stay in the lead with these new emerging technologies or suffer the consequences. The Air Force, under the previous 2 chiefs, Mark Welch and Dave Goldfein, has built a strong, and I would tell you, a first-class bench of officers coming up to handle this new warfighting era. And we are establishing at NDIA an Emerging Technology Institute to support these efforts. Coupled with the Mitchell Institute and the Air Force Association, we hope to be another source of strong support and encouragement for our airmen. That concludes me, Dave. Thank you.
You bet. Well, thank you all, gentlemen, for your insights on this topic. For the benefit of the audience, I thought I'd answer your 3 questions, Dick. The last time a U.S. Air Force officer was appointed a chairman was 2001. That's 19 years ago. And with respect to the command positions of our principal warfighting commands, Indo-Pacific Command and Central Command, the Air Force has never led either of those commands. Okay, we've got about 8 minutes left. In the time remaining, I'd like to get your take on just how the Air Force can better make its case. Dick, you alluded to the fact that it doesn't do a great job, but I would suggest, as all of you, I think, would agree, that the Air Force has truly become the indispensable force. What I mean by that is no joint force operation can be conducted without some element of the Department of the Air Force being involved. And that cannot be said of any other service. In this sense, the whole of the Department of Defense and the other services have a stake in the Air Force's ability to conduct its mission. So how can the Air Force better advocate for its fair share of the defense budget? Let me turn that first opportunity over to Chief Moseley, and then Congressman Bacon, and then Dick, you can wrap it up.
Yeah, General DEPTULA, thanks. Let me go back to that notion of joint senior officers. I take some issue. Zatar, you and I for years have been frustrated over lack of a commander of PACOM, and I've got some personal experience with that in the Senate Armed Services Committee and on CENTCOM. But I've got to tell you, as a guy at the table with the president and the SecDef and a guy commanding a theater effort, I haven't had that sense of frustration in the field when bombs are dropping and bullets are real and people are in harm's way. I think it's more of a frustration of equal representation pro forma than in an operational impact. But I get it. I get what you're saying, and I wish it were different, and it should be different. But the reality of when combat operations are conducted, I've not sensed at a senior level a negative piece of that. So yes, would I like to have an airman at Indo-Pacific and at CENTCOM and as the chairman? Of course. But I'd rather have a CFAC that understands how to fight. And I'd rather have wing commanders that understand how to deploy and general officers that understand how to orchestrate things. And then the rest of it is up to an administration and civilians. But when you talk about making the case for the Air Force, I think that is several intersecting bits of thinking. There's a media piece of that. And if you think back into the 1930s and 1940s, who were the people that were best at making the case for an independent Air Force? It was airmen. It was a guy named Mitchell. It was a guy named Arnold. It was a guy named Spotts. It was a guy named Doolittle. It was a guy named Aker. And in the 1950s, making the case for a strategic Air Force, it was a guy named LeMay. It was movies, Strategic Air Command. It was an outreach to the American people of what the United States Air Force does, what it represents, and the mission. So I think there's a piece of that that is just pure outreach. I think there's an educational piece on the Hill. Congressman Bacon knows better than any of us on here that while there are 535 plus 2 elected representatives and senators and the president and vice president, there are thousands of staffers. And of those thousands of staffers over there, what is the percent that actually understand combat in the third dimension and combat from a joint perspective? So it's also Air Force Association's possible outreach to the staff, just like from the legislative liaison world, which we would do. The Mitchell Institute does, AFA does, and it's also with industry. You know, I would hand the ball over to Mr. MCCONN, because when the Navy builds a ship, they get multiple year funding from the shipbuilding account. Where is that account for a $1 trillion F-35 program? Where is that account for a new bomber? Where is that account for the next generation air dominance fighter? If you're going to build a carrier that costs $14 billion and you're going to do it over an extended period of time and industry supports a shipbuilding account, where's the equivalent for an aerospace account? Especially when you throw space into that and you throw the nuclear modernization piece into that and you throw this new preparatory fielding of systems for a new start. So I think the Air Force should be more aggressive. I think the Air Force should have much more aggressive outreach through the media, through activities on the Hill, but also you've got to be aggressive in the building. I mean, you've got to show up every day knowing what an Air Force does and what an Air Force contributes and how to play in a joint world and how to play nicely in a joint world until you don't. And so I think there is opportunity here across the board to make the case of 31 years in combat, aging systems, obsolescence in aging systems, and the criticality of new combat systems, new fighters, new bombers, new spacecraft. And we understand very well, I think, how difficult this is, but there are folks literally out there that think this is easy because we make it look easy. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks very much, Chief. We got about 1 minute each, Congressman Bacon and Dick.
When I first came in about 4 years ago, the Navy had a really clear message. Half our aircraft can't fly. When you talk to the Army, they say we have 58 combat brigades, only 3 can deploy tonight or fight tonight. Then you get to the Air Force, it was a little more complicated. So to get to your point, General DEPTULA, I just think we have to keep it more simple when we're making our case, because we sound too technical often when I think we need that technical because you got to dig in and bore in for certain folks. But to make your case on the Hill, it's got to be a simple case. And when the Navy comes in and says, half our Navy aircraft can't fly today, boom, that's a problem. So we got to be able to come in and talk about our average age of aircraft versus what it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago. We got to talk about our lethality that we can bring that no other service brings. We get any target, anywhere, anytime. But we got B-52s that are nearing 60 years old. But we got to keep it simple. I don't know that the Air Force does it well. I think General Goldfein really turned things around in making the case for the Air Force, I believe. And we got to build on what he has done. And I think we've gone a long ways the last 4 years. Let me just close on the staffs. You know, the average staff is 2% veteran. Our staff's 35% in our office. Very proud. We got a great military liaison staff. I think the best in all of Congress. But to get to General Moseley's point, most staffs have very little background on this. So you got to keep it simple if you want to make your case.
Thanks, Mr. Congressman. Over to you, Dick.
Thank you, Dave. Number one, Air Force must stand up for itself and help set DoD priorities. Number two, we need to educate decision makers on Capitol Hill, in OSD, and actually in the public and the media. Number three, push for transparency of budgets. Number four, push DoD to set priorities congruent with the national defense strategy. Number five, Air Force must continue to lead with a strong bench of people that we have at the present time. Some of the new acquisition practices developed by people like Will Roper are very helpful for the future. Number six, Air Force has to work hard on jointness. And number seven, I guess I've mentioned it already. We need to get our message out to the media and to the public. Thank you, Dave.
Well, we have come to the end of this special Aerospace Nation series. And gentlemen, it was truly an honor and a privilege to host you today at AFA's Virtual Aerospace and Cyber Conference. And thank you for all that you continue to do to defend our nation. And thank you all to those who turned in to watch this Mitchell Institute panel on transparency and military budgets. Please be sure to check out AFA's daily report for the latest coverage on our conference. And with that, all of you have a great aerospace power kind of day.